I was standing in my living room with a cup of coffee when I heard the crunch of metal and wood that would change my entire winter. Through the frosted window, I watched a silver Lexus plow through my newly installed fence, scattering pristine white pickets across my snow-covered yard like broken teeth. The blizzard had been hammering Pine Ridge, Colorado for 6 hours straight, turning our quiet subdivision into something resembling Antarctica. And apparently, someone had decided driving in near-zero visibility was a brilliant idea. I grabbed my coat and rushed outside, the wind immediately stealing my breath. Snow whipped against my face as I trudged through knee-deep drifts toward the accident. The Lexus sat at an awkward angle, its front bumper crumpled against what remained of my fence. The driver's door opened, and out stepped Patricia Montgomery, the vice president of our homeowners association, and the most insufferable person I had ever met in my 32 years of existence. Patricia was a woman in her late 40s with blonde highlights that looked expensive, and a permanent expression of disapproval etched into her features. She wore a designer winter coat that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, and even in the middle of a catastrophic snowstorm, her makeup looked perfect. She stumbled through the snow toward me, her high-heeled boots completely inappropriate for the weather. "Marcus," she shouted over the wind. "Marcus Irving, what is the meaning of this?" I stared at her, genuinely confused. "What is the meaning of what? You just drove through my fence." "Your fence jumped out in front of me. I couldn't see anything in this storm, and you have no warning lights, no reflectors, nothing to indicate there was a structure here." My jaw dropped. "Patricia, this fence has been here for 3 weeks. You drove past it literally yesterday when you were leaving me that violation notice about my holiday decorations being 2 inches too tall." She pulled her coat tighter around herself, her face reddening from more than just the cold. "That is completely beside the point. As a homeowner in Pine Ridge Estates, you have a responsibility to ensure that all structures on your property are properly marked and visible during inclement weather. This is clearly stated in the HOA bylaws, Section 12, subsection 4. I had read the HOA bylaws front to back when I moved in 18 months ago, desperately trying to avoid the kind of situation I now found myself in. There was no such requirement. "Patricia, that's not a real rule, and even if it were, you still crashed into my property. We need to call the police and file an accident report." "Absolutely not," she said, her voice taking on that shrill quality that made every HOA meeting unbearable. "This is an internal neighborhood matter. We will handle this through proper HOA channels." Before I could argue, she stomped back to her Lexus, started the engine, and somehow managed to reverse out of the wreckage. Her tires spun uselessly for a moment before gaining traction, and then she was gone, disappearing into the white curtain of falling snow. I stood there, frozen in more ways than one, staring at the destruction of my fence. The installation had cost me $3,000, money I had saved carefully over 6 months. Now it looked like a giant had played pickup sticks with the remains. I pulled out my phone and took dozens of pictures from every angle, making sure to capture the tire tracks, the damage to both the fence and the places where her bumper had clearly made contact. The snow was already starting to fill in the evidence, so I worked quickly, my fingers going numb inside my gloves. Back inside, I called my insurance company. The representative, a tired-sounding woman named Jennifer, listened to my story with the patience of someone who had heard 1,000 similar tales. "So let me get this straight," Jennifer said. "A member of your HOA board crashed into your fence during a blizzard, blamed you for not having warning lights, and then left the scene. That about sums it up. Did you call the police? She drove off before I could. Should I call them now? Jennifer sighed. You should, yes. This is technically a hit and run, even if it happened on private property. We will need a police report to process your claim. Document everything, Mr. Irving. Everything. I called the Pine Ridge Police Department non-emergency line. The dispatcher told me that due to the storm, they were prioritizing life-threatening emergencies, but they would send an officer when possible. That turned out to be 6 hours later when the snow had finally stopped and the world looked like it had been wrapped in cotton. Officer David Chen was a young guy, probably mid-20s, who looked genuinely apologetic about the delay. He took my statement, examined the wreckage, and reviewed the photos on my phone. This is pretty straightforward, he said, making notes on his tablet. The tire tracks clearly show she lost control and hit your fence. No question about fault here. You said the driver is Patricia Montgomery? Yeah, she's on the HOA board. Do you know her? Officer Chen's expression turned carefully neutral. I have responded to several calls involving Mrs. Montgomery. She has strong opinions about law enforcement priorities. That was putting it mildly. Patricia had made headlines in our local newspaper last summer when she tried to have 2 police officers reprimanded for refusing to ticket a resident whose grass was a 1/4 inch too long. The story had been equal parts embarrassing and hilarious. I will go speak with Mrs. Montgomery now, Officer Chen said. You should receive a copy of the report within 48 hours. Use that for your insurance claim. He left, and I spent the rest of the evening clearing snow from my driveway and trying to salvage what I could of the fence. Most of it was beyond repair. The posts had been snapped at the base, and the decorative finials I had spent hours selecting lay scattered and broken across the yard. 2 days later, I received a certified letter. My hands shook as I opened it, somehow knowing before I even read the contents that my life was about to get significantly more complicated. The letter was from Whitmore and Associates, a law firm in downtown Denver. It informed me that their client, Patricia Montgomery, was pursuing legal action against me for negligence, property damage to her vehicle, emotional distress, and violation of HOA safety regulations. They were seeking $25,000 in damages. I read the letter 3 times, certain I had misunderstood something. Patricia had crashed into my fence, and now she was suing me for $25,000. The sheer audacity of it took my breath away. I immediately called my insurance company again. This time I got a different representative, a man named Paul who sounded significantly less sympathetic than Jennifer. Mr. Irving, I am looking at your policy now. Your homeowner's insurance does include liability coverage, but this is a very unusual situation. You will need to provide all documentation related to the incident and the HOA regulations she is claiming you violated. There are no such regulations, I said, frustration creeping into my voice. She made them up. Then you will need to prove that. Do you have a copy of your HOA bylaws? Of course I do. I will send them over today. I spent the next hour scanning every page of the Pine Ridge Estates HOA bylaws, covenants, and restrictions. It was a mind-numbing document, full of regulations about everything from approved paint colors to the maximum height of mailbox posts. But nowhere, absolutely nowhere, was there any requirement for warning lights or reflectors on fences during winter weather. I emailed everything to Paul, then called my neighbor, Frank Rodriguez. Frank had lived in Pine Ridge Estates for 15 years and had served on the HOA board before Patricia's faction took control. He was a retired accountant with a sharp mind and an even sharper dislike for what he called Patricia's reign of terror. "Marcus, my boy," Frank said when he answered the phone. "I heard about your fence. Patricia has been telling everyone you attacked her with it." "She what?" "Oh yes. According to her version of events, you deliberately placed that fence in an unsafe location specifically to damage her vehicle. She has been going door to door, trying to drum up support for some kind of emergency HOA meeting to have you fined." I felt a headache building behind my eyes. "Frank, this is insane. She crashed into my property and now she is suing me." I know. "Listen, you need to understand something about Patricia. She has never been wrong about anything in her entire life, at least according to her. When reality does not match her perception, she simply rewrites reality. She has done this to 3 other homeowners in the past 2 years. Remember the Johnsons?" I did remember the Johnsons. They had been forced to sell their house and move after Patricia led a campaign against them for having the wrong shade of beige on their shutters. The legal fees and HOA fines had bankrupted them. "What do I do?" I asked. "You fight," Frank said simply. "You document everything, you do not give her an inch, and you make her prove every single claim in court. Patricia relies on people being too tired or too scared to stand up to her. The moment someone calls her bluff, she usually backs down. Usually." That last word hung in the air ominously. The emergency HOA meeting happened on a Tuesday evening at the Pine Ridge Community Center. I walked in to find about 40 of my neighbors seated in folding chairs, their faces ranging from curious to hostile. Patricia stood at the front of the room next to her husband, Gerald, a quiet man who always looked vaguely apologetic for his wife's existence. Also present was Linda Mercer, the HOA president, a woman in her 50s who seemed to view her position as equivalent to being mayor of a small city. She had a gavel, which she used frequently and with great enthusiasm. Rounding out the board was Thomas Keller, the treasurer, a former banker who treated HOA funds like they were the Federal Reserve. "This meeting will come to order," Linda announced, banging her gavel 3 times. "We are here tonight to discuss a serious safety violation committed by one of our homeowners, Mr. Marcus Irving." I stood up. "Excuse me, but I have not violated anything. Patricia crashed into my fence during a snowstorm." Patricia leaped to her feet, pointing an accusing finger at me. "Your dangerous, unmarked fence caused over $6,000 in damage to my vehicle. You have created a hazard in our community, and you must be held accountable. The fence is 4 feet inside my property line," I said, keeping my voice level. "It meets all HOA specifications for height, style, and materials. I have the approval form right here, signed by this very board 6 months ago." I held up the document. Patricia's face turned an interesting shade of purple. "That approval was granted under false pretenses," she sputtered. "You never mentioned that you would not be installing proper safety lighting. Because there is no requirement for safety lighting on decorative fences," I said. "Show me where in the bylaws it says I need warning lights on my fence." Linda banged her gavel again. "Mr. Irving, the HOA board has discretionary authority to enforce safety standards as we see fit, even if those standards are not explicitly written in the bylaws." I pulled out my phone and opened the document I had prepared. "Actually, according to Colorado Revised Statutes Title 38, Article 33.3, Section 106, HOA boards can only enforce rules that are clearly documented in the governing documents. You cannot arbitrarily create new rules and then retroactively punish homeowners for not following them." The room went silent. Linda looked at Thomas, who looked at Patricia, who looked like she wanted to murder me with her eyes. "Furthermore," I continued, "I have filed a police report regarding the accident. Officer David Chen determined that Patricia lost control of her vehicle due to driving too fast for conditions, and that the accident was entirely her fault. I am happy to provide copies of that report to anyone who wants one. I had printed 20 copies specifically for this purpose. I began distributing them to the other homeowners, who accepted them with expressions ranging from shocked to amused. Patricia snatched one from my hand. "This report is biased. Officer Chen has had it out for me ever since I reported him for parking illegally at the community entrance. He was responding to an emergency call," someone in the back muttered. "That is irrelevant," Patricia shrieked. The meeting devolved from there. Several homeowners spoke up in my defense, including Frank, who gave a passionate speech about the importance of not allowing the HOA to overstep its authority. Others, mostly friends of Patricia's, argued that safety must be the top priority and that I should be fined regardless of what the bylaws said. In the end, Linda called for a vote on whether to fine me $5,000 for creating a community hazard. The vote failed, 9 in favor and 18 against. Patricia looked ready to explode. "This is not over," she hissed at me as I left the community center. "You will pay for embarrassing me like this." I should have taken her threat more seriously. 3 days later, I received another letter, this time from the HOA itself. It informed me that my dues were being increased by $300 per month to cover enhanced community safety initiatives. The letter was signed by all 3 board members. I immediately called Frank. "Can they do this?" "Not legally, no," Frank said. "Dues increases require a vote of the general membership with at least 30 days' notice. They are trying to financially punish you without going through proper channels. You need to lawyer up, Marcus." Finding a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes turned out to be easier than I expected. Colorado apparently had a thriving cottage industry of attorneys who dealt with nothing but homeowners association nightmares. I ended up hiring Mitchell Brennan, a sharp-eyed attorney in his early 40s who came highly recommended by Frank. Mitchell listened to my story while taking meticulous notes. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and shook his head. "I have seen a lot of HOA overreach in my career," he said, "but this is aggressive even by those standards. Patricia Montgomery is essentially trying to bankrupt you for the crime of being the victim of her bad driving. The good news is that we have a very strong case. The bad news is that fighting this is going to be expensive and time-consuming." "How expensive?" "Depends on how far she wants to take it. If she actually files the lawsuit and refuses to settle, we could be looking at $20,000 to $30,000 in legal fees, possibly more if it goes to trial." I felt sick. "I do not have that kind of money. I know. That is what she is counting on. Most people in your situation would just pay her off to make the problem go away. But here is the thing, if you do that, you set a precedent. Patricia will know she can target any homeowner she wants and extort money from them. You would not be the last victim. You would just be the most recent." He was right, and I knew it. This was not just about my fence anymore. This was about whether Patricia could turn our HOA into her personal fiefdom where she made the rules and punished anyone who dared to disagree with her. "What do we do?" I asked. "We fight," Mitchell said. "And we make sure everyone in your community knows exactly what Patricia is doing." The first step was filing a formal complaint against the HOA board with the Colorado Division of Real Estate, which regulated homeowners associations in the state. Mitchell drafted a detailed document outlining every violation the board had committed, from the improper dues increase to the attempt to fine me without proper justification. The second step was going public. Mitchell helped me write a letter to every homeowner in Pine Ridge Estates, explaining the situation and providing documentation of everything that had happened. I paid to have the letters professionally printed and mailed, which cost me $800 I could not really afford, but the investment paid off. Within a week, my phone was ringing off the hook. Neighbors I barely knew called to express their support. Others shared their own horror stories about Patricia and the HOA board. One couple, the Martins, told me they had been fined $1,500 for having the wrong color welcome mat. Another homeowner, Sarah Chen, said she had been threatened with a lien on her house for planting tulips instead of the approved daffodils. Frank organized a petition calling for the removal of Patricia, Linda, and Thomas from the HOA board. Within 2 weeks, he had gathered signatures from over 60% of the homeowners in Pine Ridge Estates. Patricia responded by doubling down. She filed her lawsuit, and I was officially served with papers demanding $25,000 in damages. According to the complaint, I had negligently failed to properly mark my fence, causing her severe emotional distress, physical injury to her neck and back, and damage to her vehicle. She also claimed that the stress of the incident had affected her ability to perform her HOA duties, for which she deserved additional compensation. The idea that Patricia performed any actual duties as vice president was laughable. Mostly she drove around the neighborhood looking for violations and harassing people about their landscaping choices. Mitchell filed our response, denying all allegations and countersuing for the cost of replacing my fence, plus legal fees. We also filed a motion to have Patricia's claim dismissed as frivolous. The first court date was set for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, life in Pine Ridge Estates became increasingly tense. Patricia's supporters began leaving passive-aggressive notes on the cars of anyone who had signed Frank's petition. Someone spray-painted HOA Trader on Frank's mailbox. Another homeowner found their trash cans overturned repeatedly, garbage strewn across their lawn each morning. I installed security cameras around my property, which turned out to be a smart decision. 2 weeks before the court date, my cameras caught Patricia herself standing in my yard at 2 in the morning, taking photographs of my fence replacement with a professional camera. "What are you doing?" I called out, stepping onto my porch. Patricia jumped, startled, then recovered her composure. "I am documenting evidence for my lawsuit. This fence is even more dangerous than the last one. You have created a safety hazard, and I am going to make sure the judge sees that. You are trespassing on my property at 2 in the morning. That is a crime. I am performing my duties as HOA vice president. I have the right to inspect any property in this community at any time to ensure compliance with our standards. No, you do not. Leave now, or I am calling the police." She left, but not before taking several more photographs. I immediately downloaded the security footage and sent it to Mitchell, who added it to our growing pile of evidence showing Patricia's obsessive behavior. The preliminary hearing was held in a Denver courthouse on a gray Monday morning. I arrived with Mitchell to find Patricia already seated with her attorney, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit named Richard Whitmore. He was the founding partner of the firm that had sent me the original demand letter. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Margaret Thornton, reviewed the case file with an expression that grew increasingly skeptical as she read. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Judge Thornton said. "Mrs. Montgomery, you drove your vehicle into Mr. Irving's fence during a blizzard, and you are now suing him for damages." "Yes, Your Honor," Richard Whitmore said smoothly. "Mr. Irving failed to properly mark his fence with warning lights or reflectors in violation of HOA regulations. My client suffered significant injuries as a result of his negligence." "What injuries?" the judge asked. Whitmore shuffled through his papers. Mrs. Montgomery sustained whiplash and back injuries from the collision. She has been unable to work, and she has suffered severe emotional distress. Mrs. Montgomery, you are the vice president of a homeowners association, Judge Thornton said. Is that a paid position? Patricia hesitated. No, Your Honor, it is a volunteer position. Then how have you been unable to work? I meant my volunteer work with the HOA, Patricia said quickly. And I also operate a home-based business selling essential oils and wellness products. The accident has made it difficult for me to maintain my client relationships. Judge Thornton looked at Mitchell. Does the HOA actually require warning lights on decorative fences? No, Your Honor, Mitchell said. We have provided a complete copy of the Pine Ridge Estates HOA bylaws, covenants, and restrictions. There is no such requirement anywhere in the governing documents. Additionally, the police report clearly states that Mrs. Montgomery was at fault for the accident. I would like to see that police report, Judge Thornton said. We provided it. The judge read it silently, her eyebrows rising higher with each paragraph. Mrs. Montgomery, the judge said. According to this report, you were driving at approximately 35 miles per hour in a residential area with near zero visibility. The posted speed limit is 25 miles per hour, and the investigating officer determined that you were driving too fast for conditions. Is that correct? The officer was biased against me, Patricia said. He has a history of targeting me unfairly. That is a serious accusation. Do you have evidence of this bias? Patricia's face reddened. He refused to ticket another homeowner when I reported them for a violation. A violation of what? Their grass was too long. Judge Thornton closed the file and removed her glasses. I am going to be very clear here. Based on the evidence presented, I see no basis for Mrs. Montgomery's claim. Mr. Irving had no legal obligation to install warning lights on his fence. Mrs. Montgomery crashed into that fence because she was driving too fast in dangerous weather conditions. That is textbook negligence on her part, not his. Your Honor, Whitmore began, but the judge held up a hand. I am not finished. Furthermore, I am troubled by what appears to be an abuse of the homeowners association process. Mrs. Montgomery sits on the HOA board, and she appears to be using that position to harass Mr. Irving. This is exactly the kind of behavior that gives HOAs a bad reputation. Patricia stood up, her voice shrill. I have done nothing wrong. That fence is a hazard to the entire community, and he should be held responsible. Sit down, Mrs. Montgomery, Judge Thornton said coldly. I am dismissing your claim with prejudice, which means you cannot refile it. Additionally, I am awarding Mr. Irving his court costs and attorney fees. You will pay for the frivolous lawsuit you filed against him. Patricia looked like she had been slapped. Whitmore tried to argue, but the judge was done listening. She granted Mitchell's motion to dismiss and ended the hearing. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Patricia confronted me, her face twisted with rage. This is not over, she hissed. You think you have won. I will make your life a living hell. I will fine you for every tiny violation I can find. I will make you wish you had never moved to Pine Ridge Estates. Mrs. Montgomery, Mitchell said calmly, what you just described is illegal retaliation. If you take any action against my client because of this lawsuit, we will file charges, and you will end up in far more trouble than you are already in. We will see about that, Patricia said, then stormed off, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, I received a notice that the HOA was scheduling a hearing to potentially revoke my right to use the community amenities, including the pool, the gym, and the clubhouse. The reason given was conduct unbecoming a member of the Pine Ridge Estates community. I showed the notice to Mitchell, who actually laughed out loud. "She really does not know when to quit," he said. "This is blatant retaliation. We can shut this down pretty easily." He sent a strongly worded letter to the HOA board, pointing out that their actions constituted illegal retaliation, and that we would be pursuing further legal action if they did not immediately rescind the hearing notice. He also sent a copy of the letter to the Colorado Division of Real Estate, which was already investigating the board based on the complaint we had filed earlier. The hearing was canceled within 48 hours, but Patricia was not done. She began showing up at my house at random times, claiming she needed to inspect my property for violations. I refused to let her in, which led to more threats and more notices of alleged violations. I was cited for having my trash cans visible from the street for more than 2 hours on collection day. I was cited for having a lawn ornament that was not on the approved list. I was cited for having a Christmas wreath on my door past January 10th. Every citation came with a fine of $250. I disputed every single one through official HOA channels, which required written responses and documentation. It was exhausting and time-consuming, exactly what Patricia wanted. Frank continued to organize resistance within the community. The petition to remove the board members gained more signatures. Other homeowners came forward with their own stories of Patricia's abuses. A retired teacher named Dorothy Walsh revealed that Patricia had threatened to report her to social services for child neglect because her teenage grandson had left his bicycle on the lawn overnight. The situation finally reached a breaking point in March. I came home from work to find that someone had poured motor oil all over my driveway and front walkway. It was a mess, black and sticky, and nearly impossible to clean. My security cameras caught the whole thing. The footage showed Patricia's Lexus pulling up to my house at 3 in the afternoon. She got out, looked around to make sure no one was watching, then pulled 2 large containers of motor oil from her trunk. She systematically poured them across my driveway, then got back in her car and drove away. I called the police immediately. This time, Officer Chen arrived within 20 minutes. "Mr. Irving," he said after reviewing the footage, "this is vandalism, possibly criminal mischief. With this video evidence, we can press charges against Mrs. Montgomery." "Do it," I said. I was done being nice. Patricia had made my life hell for months, and she clearly had no intention of stopping. Officer Chen took a copy of the security footage and filed a formal report. 2 days later, Patricia was arrested at her home and charged with criminal mischief and harassment. The local news picked up the story because, of course, they did. HOA vice president arrested for vandalizing homeowners' property was too good a headline to pass up. The arrest seemed to break something in Patricia. She showed up at an emergency HOA board meeting, ranting and raving about conspiracies and persecution. Several board members tried to calm her down, but she was beyond reason. She accused me of being part of a coordinated attack designed to destroy her reputation. She accused Frank of bribing homeowners to sign his petition. She even accused her own husband, Gerald, of not supporting her enough. Gerald, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, finally stood up. "Patricia," he said quietly, "you crashed into his fence. That is what started this. You could have just apologized and paid to fix it. Instead, you sued him, you harassed him, and you vandalized his property. This is not a conspiracy. This is consequences." Patricia stared at her husband like she did not recognize him. Then she grabbed her purse and walked out of the meeting. We later learned that Gerald filed for divorce the next week. The criminal case against Patricia moved forward. Mitchell connected me with the prosecutor handling the case, a sharp woman named Amanda Foster who had zero tolerance for HOA abuse cases. "I see a lot of these," Amanda told me. "People get a little bit of power through an HOA board, and they convince themselves they are untouchable. The video evidence you have is excellent. Combined with the documented history of harassment, I think we can get a conviction." Patricia's attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but Amanda was not interested in going easy on her. The vandalism charge alone carried a potential sentence of up to 90 days in jail and a fine. The harassment charge added more potential penalties. The case went to trial in June. I testified about the entire ordeal, from the initial accident through months of harassment and retaliation. Frank testified about Patricia's pattern of abusing her position on the HOA board. Officer Chen testified about responding to multiple calls involving Patricia's behavior. And the jury watched the security footage of Patricia deliberately vandalizing my property. The trial lasted 3 days. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on both charges. Judge Thornton, who happened to be assigned to the criminal case as well, showed no mercy during sentencing. "Mrs. Montgomery," she said, "you had every opportunity to handle this situation appropriately. Instead, you chose to abuse your position, harass a neighbor, file a frivolous lawsuit, and ultimately commit acts of vandalism. Your behavior is a textbook example of HOA overreach and personal vindictiveness." She sentenced Patricia to 30 days in jail, 2 years of probation, community service, and restitution for all damages I had incurred, including my legal fees, the cost of cleaning my driveway, and the replacement fence. The total came to just over $42,000. Patricia was also required to resign from the HOA board immediately and was permanently banned from serving in any HOA leadership position in the state of Colorado. Watching Patricia being led out of the courtroom in handcuffs was surreal. Part of me felt sorry for her because she had clearly let her need for control destroy her entire life. But mostly, I just felt relieved that it was finally over. The aftermath was surprisingly positive. With Patricia gone, Linda and Thomas also resigned from the HOA board, recognizing that they had enabled her behavior and that the community had lost faith in their leadership. Frank agreed to serve as interim president while new elections were organized. The new board, elected in August, consisted entirely of reasonable people who viewed the HOA as a tool for maintaining property values and community standards, not as a weapon for enforcing petty grudges. They immediately rescinded all the bogus fines Patricia had issued against me and several other homeowners. They also revised the HOA bylaws to include clearer limitations on board authority and stronger protections for homeowners facing disciplinary action. My fence was rebuilt, this time paid for with the restitution money Patricia was required to pay. I opted for the same design as before because I liked it and because there was a certain satisfaction in replacing exactly what she had destroyed. Gerald Montgomery moved out of Pine Ridge Estates that fall. I ran into him at the grocery store one day, and we had an awkward conversation in the produce section. "I want to apologize," he said. "I knew Patricia was going too far and I should have stopped her sooner. I just kept thinking she would calm down eventually." "It is not your fault," I told him, and I meant it. "You cannot control another person's choices." He nodded, looking tired. "I heard she got out of jail last week. She is living with her sister in Boulder now. The divorce will be final next month. How are you doing?" "Honestly, better than I have been in years. I forgot what it was like to not be constantly anxious about what Patricia would do next." We talked for a few more minutes, then went our separate ways. I never saw him again. Life in Pine Ridge Estates gradually returned to normal, or at least to a new normal. The community felt lighter somehow, like an oppressive weight had been lifted. Neighbors actually waved to each other again. The HOA meetings became boring affairs focused on budget discussions and maintenance schedules, exactly what they should have been all along. I kept the security cameras up, just in case. Mitchell advised me to maintain documentation of everything HOA related for at least a few more years, to protect myself if any of Patricia's allies tried to resurrect her vendetta. But months passed without incident. The local news ran a follow-up story about the case, focusing on HOA reform and the need for stronger oversight of homeowners associations. Mitchell was interviewed extensively, and he used the opportunity to talk about the broader issues with HOA governance in Colorado. The story prompted the state legislature to consider new regulations requiring better transparency and accountability for HOA boards. As for me, I finally felt like I could relax in my own home. I planted a garden that spring, carefully following all the HOA guidelines for approved plants and placement. I repainted my shutters the exact shade of approved beige. I made sure my trash cans were never visible for more than the permitted 2 hours on collection day. Not because I was afraid of being fined, but because I wanted to prove that I could be a good member of the community while still standing up for myself when necessary. There was a difference between following reasonable rules and submitting to tyranny, and I had learned where that line was. Frank became a good friend. We started a tradition of having beers on Friday evenings, sitting on my back deck and talking about everything from sports to politics to the absurdities of HOA regulations. He told me stories about the early days of Pine Ridge Estates, before Patricia's faction had taken control of the board, when the HOA had actually functioned the way it was supposed to. "You did something important," Frank said one evening, watching the sun set over the mountains. "You stood up to a bully and you won. A lot of people were watching to see if it was possible to fight back against someone like Patricia and actually win. You showed them it was." "I just did not want to pay for damage I did not cause," I said. "It was more than that, and you know it." This was about whether one person could turn an HOA into their personal kingdom. You proved they could not, at least not without consequences. He was right, though I had not thought about it in those terms while I was living through it. I had been too focused on surviving each day, on responding to each new attack, on keeping my head above water financially and emotionally. Only in hindsight could I see the bigger picture. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Patricia had tried to join the HOA board in her new community in Boulder. The board there had looked into her background, found the news stories about her arrest and conviction, and politely declined her application. She had also tried to start a home business selling essential oils, but her social media presence was so toxic that potential customers kept discovering her history and backing away. I did not take any pleasure in her continued struggles. Honestly, I just wanted her to get help and find some kind of peace. The level of anger and need for control that had driven her behavior suggested deeper psychological issues that jail time and fines would not resolve. But that was not my responsibility. I had my own life to live, my own happiness to pursue. I started dating again, something I had put on hold during the months of legal battles. I met Laura Bennett at a coffee shop, a veterinary technician with an easy laugh and a refreshing lack of drama in her life. When I told her about the fence incident and everything that followed, she listened with wide eyes. "That is the craziest HOA story I have ever heard," she said. "And I grew up in a neighborhood with an HOA that tried to ban dogs over 20 pounds. Did they succeed? No, my dad sued them and won. Apparently, fighting ridiculous HOA rules runs in my family. I liked her immediately. By the following winter, a full year after Patricia had crashed into my fence, I found myself standing in my living room with a cup of coffee, watching snow fall gently outside my window. The new fence stood strong and intact, its white pickets pristine against the fresh snow. No one had crashed into it. No one had threatened to sue me. The HOA had sent me a cheerful holiday card signed by all the board members. It was almost boring, and I loved every minute of it. Laura came up behind me and wrapped her arms around my waist. "What are you thinking about?" Just remembering last year. This time, Patricia had just crashed into my fence, and I had no idea how crazy everything was about to get. "Do you regret how you handled it, fighting instead of just paying her off?" I thought about it for a moment. No. If I had paid her, she would have just moved on to the next victim. And I would have spent the rest of my time here looking over my shoulder, wondering when she would come after me again. At least this way, it is really over. Do you think she learned anything from it? Probably not, I said honestly. People like Patricia rarely do. They are so convinced they are right that they cannot see how their own actions create the problems they complain about. But maybe I am wrong. Maybe jail and divorce and losing everything was enough of a wake-up call. "You are a better person than me," Laura said. "If someone had put me through all that, I would not be hoping they learned and grew. I would just be hoping they moved far away and never came back." I laughed. I hope that too. Personal growth and geographical distance are not mutually exclusive. We spent that evening decorating for the holidays, making sure every decoration was exactly within HOA guidelines. It was a running joke between us now. Laura had even made custom ornaments that said things like HOA approved and regulation holiday cheer. The second anniversary of the fence incident came and went without fanfare. Patricia's restitution payments arrived like clockwork every month, automatically deposited into my bank account. I used the money to make improvements to my house, to take Laura on nice dates, and to build up a proper emergency fund so that if anything like this ever happened again, I would be financially prepared. Frank stepped down as HOA president after serving for 2 years, satisfied that he had helped restore the organization to something functional and fair. His replacement, a retired engineer named Robert Sullivan, continued the reforms Frank had started. The HOA even started a newsletter highlighting positive community events instead of listing violations. I ran into Dorothy Walsh at the community pool one summer afternoon. Her grandson, now 17, was lifeguarding for the summer. "Marcus," she said, settling into the lounge chair next to mine. "I never properly thanked you." "For what?" "For standing up to Patricia. After she got arrested, I was able to sleep at night for the first time in 2 years. I had been so stressed about her threats to call social services that I was making myself sick. You showed all of us that she was not untouchable." "I just did what anyone would do," I said. "No," Dorothy said firmly. "Most people would have given in. Most people would have paid her off and tried to stay under her radar. You fought, and you won, and you made this community better for everyone." It was humbling to realize how many people had been affected by Patricia's reign of terror. I had been so focused on my own situation that I had not fully appreciated how many others had been suffering quietly, afraid to speak up, because they had seen what happened to those who did. The third winter after the incident, I proposed to Laura. We got married in the spring at a venue outside of Pine Ridge Estates, because neither of us wanted to deal with the HOA regulations about hosting events on private property. Frank was my best man. Dorothy came and cried happy tears. Even Officer Chen stopped by the reception to congratulate us. We bought a house together in a neighborhood with no HOA. It was a smaller place, needed some work, but it was ours, and we could paint it any color we wanted. We could plant any flowers we liked. We could leave our trash cans out as long as we wanted, though we never did because that would be objectively unpleasant for everyone. I kept the house in Pine Ridge Estates and rented it out. The tenant was a quiet accountant who paid on time and never had any issues with the HOA. I stayed on the email list for community updates, partly to keep track of my investment property and partly out of morbid curiosity. 5 years after the fence incident, I received an email that Patricia Montgomery had passed away. She had been living alone in a small apartment in Boulder, estranged from her family and most of her former friends. The obituary was brief and mentioned no survivors except a sister. There was no funeral, just a small memorial service that apparently only 3 people attended. I felt a complicated mix of emotions reading that email. Sadness that someone's life had spiraled so far downward. Relief that I would never have to worry about her coming back and trying to restart her vendetta. Guilt for feeling that relief. "You okay?" Laura asked, noticing my expression. "Patricia died," I said, showing her the email. Laura read it, then set my phone down. "That is sad. But you know what? She made her choices. Every step of the way she chose anger and control over compromise and compassion. You gave her opportunities to back down, to apologize, to handle things like a reasonable person. She refused every time. You are allowed to feel relieved that you do not have to think about her anymore. She was right, as usual." I let myself feel whatever I felt, then closed my email and moved on with my day. Patricia had consumed enough of my time and energy over the years. I was not going to give her any more. Even in death, life continued. My rental property in Pine Ridge Estates remained profitable. The HOA there continued to function smoothly under reasonable leadership. I heard through Frank that several other homeowners had sued former board members for various abuses, emboldened by my successful case against Patricia. The HOA reform movement in Colorado gained momentum, resulting in new state laws that gave homeowners more protections and required greater transparency from HOA boards. I like to think that my fight with Patricia had contributed to those changes in some small way. That by refusing to be bullied, by documenting everything, by taking the time and spending the money to fight back through proper legal channels, I had helped create a system where fewer people would have to go through what I went through. But mostly, I was just happy to be past it. Happy to have a wife I loved, a house with no HOA restrictions, a life that was pleasantly boring in all the right ways. The fence incident had taught me a lot about standing up for myself, about the importance of documentation, about how small abuses of power could snowball into major conflicts if left unchecked. It had also taught me the value of community support. Without Frank organizing neighbors, without other homeowners sharing their stories, without Mitchell's excellent legal representation, I probably would have lost. Fighting back against an HOA board requires resources, determination, and allies. I had been lucky to have all 3. Now, years later, when people ask me about the scar on my fence in the photos from my old house, I tell them the story. Some people laugh at the absurdity of it. Others shake their heads in sympathy. A few share their own HOA horror stories, and I listen and offer advice based on what I learned. The most common question is whether I would do it all again, knowing how much stress and money and time it would cost. The answer is yes, because the alternative would have been teaching Patricia that she could abuse her power without consequences. It would have been letting her move on to the next victim, and the one after that. It would have been contributing to a culture where HOA boards can act as petty tyrants instead of community servants. So yes, I would do it again. But I am deeply grateful I do not have to. Laura and I hosted Thanksgiving that year at our new house. Frank came along with Dorothy and her grandson. A few other former neighbors from Pine Ridge Estates made the drive. We ate too much food, told too many stories, laughed until our sides hurt. At one point, Frank raised his glass. "To Marcus," he said, "for having the courage to fight back and for showing the rest of us it was possible." Everyone raised their glasses and echoed the toast. I felt my face heat up, uncomfortable with the attention but also grateful for the support of these people who had become like family. "To reasonable HOAs," I countered, raising my own glass. "And to neighbors who actually care about community instead of just enforcing rules." We drank to that, and then someone changed the subject to football, and the moment passed. But I carried it with me, that feeling of being seen and appreciated for doing something that had felt, at the time, like simple survival. The fence that Patricia destroyed was eventually replaced again, when I renovated the rental property years later. The new tenants wanted a taller fence for privacy, and the HOA approved it without issue. The old fence, the one that had started everything, was hauled away to a landfill somewhere. But the lessons remained. The importance of standing up for yourself, the value of documentation, the power of community support, the reality that sometimes fighting back is the only way to stop a bully from hurting more people. And the knowledge that even when someone crashes into your fence, literally and metaphorically, you have the right to hold them accountable instead of accepting blame for being in their way. That fence may be gone, but what it taught me will last forever.